With the Adam Smith theory, what we found is that a country could have absolute advantage in both goods. The problem with this is that we find sometimes in the real world where a country has absolute advantage in both goods, we still find that international trade occurs. There's still exports going to a country which did not have any absolute advantage. So this is important to take note of, that this theory fails in actually showing why trade can still occur even though absolute advantage for each country did not exist. So we move on to idea from David Ricardo, which looks at the comparative advantage. Everything in comparative advantage is based on something called the terms of trade. The terms of trade is just another way of saying the price of a good. So we move to a closed economy, or autarky is another word for closed economy, meaning just trade within the country. There's no other countries that exist. And we're going to look at how we calculate terms of trade based on the same example we use for absolute advantage. So if we look at the same example, to calculate terms of trade or the cost of one apple, all you have to do is take the amount of X boxes. If we look in terms of South Africa, it's 15 X boxes that one laborer can produce, and the same laborer can produce 5 apples in South Africa. So the cost of one apple would be 15 apples divided by, or 15 X boxes, divided by the 5 apples, which means that for every one apple, 3 X boxes have to be given, or the price of one apple is 3 X boxes. So this is called the terms of trade. 3 X boxes for one apple. So if this country wanted to have 2 apples, what they had to do is give up 6 X boxes. And if they wanted to have 5 apples, they have to give up 15 X boxes. If we look at the terms of trade for Australia, for the price of apples in Australia, be the same idea. If you're always trying to find the terms of trade of a certain item or the price of the item, that item is always in the denominator. So it will be our 40 X boxes divided by the item that we're interested in, or the price of the item that we're interested in, as in apples, 4 divided by 10, which is 4. 4 X boxes for one apple, or per apple. So if you look at the cost of apples in Australia, and autarky would be 4. And the cost of the terms of trade of apples in South Africa, it would be 3. So apples are actually cheaper in South Africa, while apples in Australia is quite expensive because you have to give up 4 X boxes to produce one apple if you are only looking in terms of Australia in autarky. So that could mean there is actually some potential for these countries to trade. Because if you look at this in terms of X boxes, what is the price of X boxes in South Africa? With the terms of trade in South Africa and autarky, you will take the apples, which is 5, divided by 15, and that will give us 1/3. 1/3 apple per X box. If you had to look at the terms of trade or the cost for every X box in Australia, we would take your apples and divide it by the amount of X boxes, and then it will give you 0.25 or a quarter X box per apple. So the cost, 0.25 apple per X box. So the price of X box in Australia, which is only a quarter, is much smaller than the terms of trade in South Africa, which is the 1/3. So Australia, the X boxes are cheaper, and in South Africa, the apples are cheaper. So in other words, as Ricardo would have said, South Africa has comparative advantage in terms of apple because it takes less X boxes to produce one apple, while Australia has comparative advantage in Xboxes because it takes less apples to produce one Xbox. All in all, right, you must remember, we are assuming that Australia and South Africa have the same type of labor. They can, same, like they are replaceable in a sense. The only difference in this labor that you need to see is that the productivity of the laborers differ. Although the South African laborers produce less apples in an Xbox, the relative price or the comparative price or the terms of trade or the price per apple was cheaper in South Africa. But in Australia, the relative price or the comparative price or the terms of trade in Australia or the cost per Xbox was cheaper in Australia. So all the terms I'm using, you must be able to, whenever I use an interchangeable term, you need to be able to understand what I'm saying. But I would probably just talk about it in terms of price, in terms of trade. Those are the two terms that I will use more often. So that definitely can happen. There can be some form of trade here. Where the prices would be, if you look at it in terms of apples. So if we look in terms of apples, that's the price of apple in Australia. In South Africa. This is the terms of trade in Australia. If the price was maybe 3.5 Xbox per apple, who would that benefit? Say there was trade now. Say there was no more autarky. It was now open economy. At 3.5 Xboxes per apple. What happens here? What happens in terms of South Africa? In South Africa, all they needed to give up was 3 Xboxes per apple. Now, in terms of the world, they need to pay 3.5 Xboxes per apple. So for them, it is not worthwhile to can buy apples in the world. But what is it worthwhile for them to do? If you look at it in terms of selling and not buying in South Africa, if they had sold one apple, they would have gotten 3 Xboxes. Right? But now in the world, if they sell one apple, what are they getting now? 3.5 Xboxes. So for them, the benefit for them now is to actually sell apples to Australia because they get more Xboxes for it. So if they sold one apple in South Africa, they only gotten 3. But if they sell it to Australia or in the world, which the world price is 3.5 now, and an open economy, they will get 3.5 Xboxes. What happens in terms of Australia now? In Australia, previously, to buy one apple, they had to pay 4 Xboxes for it. That's under what we're talking. Under open economy, what are they sitting at now? Now to buy one apple, they just need to pay 3.5 Xboxes. That is a lot cheaper than paying 4 Xboxes. So for South Africa, it is now for them to sell because they get more Xboxes per apple. But for Australia, it is better for them to buy because it's cheaper per apple at 3.5 than actually paying 4 Xboxes. So there can definitely be some terms of trade, even though Australia had absolute advantage in both goods. So you need to always look at terms of trade as in what does it do in terms of buying, what does it do in terms of selling for each country. That is the example that we done for this good. And I think later on, when we deal with it later, we're going to show at what is the gains. What is the gains for selling at these prices. This is when I have actually more, when we actually have in terms of labor for South Africa, So maybe have a scenario: South Africa has 120 laborers and Australia has 150 laborers. But that is covered in week 2. We will go a bit more in depth in this example. For now, you just need to know there can happen some form of trade between these countries if we look at it in terms of trade, the Ricardian method. So Michael Porter came along and he said and he claimed, oh no, Ricardo model doesn't explain everything. It leaves out a few things. And then he mentioned what are these 4 things that he refuses to look at. So then he looks at the country's competitiveness and he says it doesn't discuss any factor conditions. It doesn't discuss resources in a sense. Then he says the thing does not discuss anything about demand conditions. It doesn't discuss anything about what are the preferences of buyers in that country, in a sense. Then he said he didn't discuss any relationship between supporting industries. So maybe for instance, if there was more goods in the country besides apples and Xboxes, then there might be apples and pears. And somehow that fertile land of the apples, you can run maybe pear trees next to it, and the benefits of the water running down the mountain from the apples to the pears can benefit each other. So there's certain industries that can help each other. So it doesn't discuss stuff like that. And then finally, it doesn't discuss any strategy of firms, the structure of firms, and even the rivalry between firms. So it misses this idea, that Ricardo has mentioned. So Michael Porter says Ricardo misses these 4 things. So there's one massive flaw in the absolute and comparative advantage models. So you must realize this. Ricardo came along and accepted a lot of what Adam Smith said. So he also said one laborer or one type of um, he also said no capital. He said there was only labor, nothing else. So he wasn't bringing the idea of land or anything else. We only have the fact of labor, no land. So this is a problem, right? What is they assuming? They're assuming that every laborer is exactly the same in a country. Meaning, how a laborer that works in an IT company, someone who codes a computer, and then a doctor, they're assuming those 2 are exactly the same. So if you wanted to close down the medical school or a hospital and then you say, hey, we're not really good at being doctors, we're going to import that service or something. Remember, in terms of trade, right? I said certain services are not really things that you trade, right? We're just going to assume for some reason you can have doctors that you can import and they come do the work. The hospitals and that you import and all this. And you have these IT guys that do coding. So you have both of these. You decide IT is where our strength is. That is where our comparative advantage or even our absolute advantage is. So we're going to specialize in producing only skill sets or work related to or resources related to IT. So we would use that. And we close our medical industry. So we move all the guys that used to originally work in the medical industry or as doctors, we can now move them freely to the IT thing. We're assuming they're exactly the same. We know by saying, is a doctor and an IT guy the same thing? No. How are we able to then assume that all labor is the same? So there's a cost for retraining these doctors and these people that work in the hospital industry. There must be a cost entailed to it. And this is the problem absolute advantage and comparative advantage doesn't adhere to or doesn't think about. It just assumes all labor is the same. So the example I gave you is a builder and teacher. I just spoke in terms of an IT guy and unfortunately a doctor. Is other idea also. If we assume other 2 types of labors, say we go and we do construction and we're comparing construction to a doctor in a hospital, right? Or in that type of industry, we don't have a lot of doctors, right? We have a bit of doctors, and we have a lot of technology that they use nowadays, those scans they do, and all these funny things. So there's a lot of technology involved in a medical industry. Construction, yes, you could argue um, there's machinery used, but let's say, for instance, that in this type of construction is a lot of digging more, digging and building walls. So we're not doing houses, and we're not doing these big um, apartments. We're not doing these big modern things that people build with lots of construction equipment. So we assume it's a lot of hands-on work. So in the building industry and the hospital industry, in the building industry, you have a labor intensive. You need more laborers than you actually need equipment or capital. While in the hospital industry, we're saying a little bit of doctors is enough, and you're having a lot of capital that you're using with this, a lot of equipment. So when you're trying to produce one more hospital, or do one more service as a doctor, because it's very capital intensive, for every one extra thing you produce in the hospital industry, it takes a lot of capital with a bit of labor. But now you want to produce more. There's a fixed amount of labor exists in the world, right? Or fixed amount of labor that exists in the country. Where are you going to have to get this extra labor and extra capital from? You have to get it from the construction industry. So when you get this construction industry, what are you finding? It's a labor intensive industry. So to get the same capital out of this industry, you're going to have to sacrifice a lot of labor intensive goods. So this labor intensive goods is a lot of labor you're sacrificing just to get the same needed capital that you might need in terms of the hospital. So that's the problem that exists. It's not like for like in terms of all resources. A capital intensive industry, you can't say, we can just to produce one more good external hospital industry, I have to produce one less in the construction industry. You might need to produce three less in the construction industry to get the same capital needed to produce that heavy capital intensive good in the hospital industry. So this is the things you need to think about it. It's just not, labor cannot be exactly the same. And the resources you use in a good cannot be exactly the same. You have to think about that type of industry. Is it the type of labor first? Is it a guy who's highly qualified? Does he have the same type of knowledge? All these type of ideas. Can you just shift the guy from other industry without having to retrain him? You have to retrain certain guys when you're moving into other industry. The second idea is, if you want to produce more in that industry, even if the labor was exactly the same, the amount of other resources you might need to produce one extra the unit might be affected by how capital intensive this industry is, or how labor intensive this industry is. You can't want to move resources and say, oh well, to produce one good of that, one extra good in this industry, all I have to do is one less. It might be that you need to produce much more, or you have to give up a lot more of the other industry, like 3, 4, 5 production units of that, just to produce one more on the side. So it's something you have to carefully reflect on. So this is actually for me one of the most major problems, and I usually test this in some form, in short questions and that. I'm not sure yet for now if your exams is going to be only essay based. For now, as it stands, it probably would be 4 essays or 5 essays, but it could possibly be that, and highly unlikely, that you could get short questions on testing this type of thinking, on the type of labor, or the flow of the model of absolute and comparative advantage.